לראש פינה, אבן מעשו הבונים, הייתה לראש פינה. 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 Last time. אבן מעשו הבונים, הייתה לראש פינה. 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 Evan Ma'asu Habonim Haita L'Rosh Pina. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. A phrase from Psalm 118 that is going to become relevant later in our discussion. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rabbi Erwin Keller from Congregation Ner Shalom. Most of you know that. Most of you are from Congregation Ner Shalom, but also in the room we've got so many of Shoshana's friends and family members and teachers and students. Shoshana looked at the list of people who had registered today and said she felt like it was her bat mitzvah. Of course, it is a rite of passage. This has been, we'll talk about the rite of passage of it, but I want to welcome everyone here to Congregation Ner Shalom, to our sanctuary. I want to thank Ner Shalom's Beit Midrash for supporting this event, offering this event, Barbara Lesh McCaffrey, our dean, and Sherry Brenner, who is operating behind the person behind the curtain, operating all of the gizmos today for us, and who handled so much of the, with Barbara, handled so much of the logistics today. So thank you both. We have the chat is off so that we can really focus on our conversation today. If there are things that you want to say to us, to let us know, you can chat with any of the co-hosts. And at the end, we'll open up the chat for everyone so people can throw all of their mazel tovs into it. I guess I ought to start by introducing Shoshana. And I don't think there's anyone in the room that doesn't already know Shoshana, but we all know her in different ways. So Shoshana Fershtman, J.D., Ph.D., is a psychologist and Jungian analyst. She has a private practice in Santa Rosa and is a member analyst and teacher at the Jung Institute in San Francisco. Her law work back in the day focused on social justice and indigenous rights. She has spent many years studying and teaching about our Jewish mystical tradition and the re-emergence of the sacred feminine in Judaism. She is a beloved spiritual leader and teacher at Congregation Ner Shalom, and is my own teacher, guide, colleague, and friend. Her new book, The Mystical Exodus in Jungian Perspective, Transforming Trauma and the Wellsprings of Renewal, is now available on pre-order, and we'll be putting into the chat a URL where you can order it and a discount code because discounts are fun. And if you order it through the publisher with this discount code, you even get free shipping, which is another exciting thing for this first day of spring. The book will be actually released with perfect timing on April 8th, just after Pesach, just after our crossing the sea and our release from the narrow place. The critical praise for the book has already been pouring in. My teacher, Rabbi Marcia Prager, calls the book a feast. Rabbi Shefa Gold, whose chant we just sang, says the book, quote, is a guide for consciously stepping onto the path of liberation by shining a light on the mythic and mystical dimensions of our inheritance. Writer and teacher Two Bears saw in the book, quote, an emergence into a deeper realization of holiness, a longing to unveil the infinite light of the divine within my soul. And she continues, I came away with an understanding that our individual life is interwoven with ancestral consciousness and an awareness of ritual and spiritual bonds. Shoshana, welcome and mazel tov to you. This book has had a long gestation, and we hope that you are blissed out that it is at last being born into the world.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's so good to be here and so good to be with everyone in the room. Many of you have been on this long journey of just my own re-engagement with Judaism and writing the book, and felt so loved and supported by all of you. And Ner Shalom has really been a place for me to find my voice, and I'm so excited to
Well,
be
we
having
are
the
so
book
happy.
launch here.
We are so happy for you, and we are so proud of you. You had wanted to open us today with an invitation to ancestors.
I thought, the book is really about the reconnection, the disconnection from, and the reconnection to our ancestral tradition, our ancestral memory. And I thought it would be really nice to just invite everyone to, if there's an ancestor, someone who's no longer with us on the physical plane, who just you want to bring into your awareness. Just take a moment to do that. Welcome, ancestors. And I also want to offer and invite, if you would like to have a journal or just something to write or draw with, we're going to take it's an opportunity to not just listen with your thinking mind, but also to just notice as we talk what feelings come up for you, maybe some memories, maybe an image from a dream, um, maybe some questions, just to notice whatever arises for you, and to really invite us all to engage the material, not just with our heads, which are very helpful, but also with our bodies and with our hearts and our kishkas. I also want to say, because I'm just looking, I have some people on my screen. I'm seeing my nieces and nephews and great nieces and great nephews, and I really love this thing I heard John Trudell, who is a Native American singer and activist, say, that we are DNA descendants and ancestors. So not just the ancestors, but also to dedicate this teaching to the descendants and the future generations, that this lineage continue with great joy.
Um, well, Shoshana, the book for I mean, none of us have had the chance to look at the final book yet, and we won't until it's in our hands. But I've gotten a chance to read the galleys, and it's breathtaking. It is erudite and it is sweeping in its scope. You teach in it about Hasidism, about the Zohar, our central Kabbalistic text. You teach about, you bring in elements of Lurianic Kabbalah, that is like our stories of the shattered vessels. You bring in Jewish renewal, as we know it, the Jewish renewal that stems from the work of Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. You bring in Jungian psychology. And in its simplest sense, the book is about trauma and healing, about disconnection and reconnection, and about the embrace of the holy and the recentering of the sacred feminine. So those are a lot of things. Those are a lot of ideas that we don't necessarily all connect with each other. And I'm wondering if you could just give us an initial sense of how these things fit together. How would you describe the central teachings of the book?
Um, well, I think maybe a way into that question is my own journey. Has really been the guide to being curious about what is the experience of um, not necessarily feeling very connected to Judaism I, and spiritually, and then kind of having that emerge, spontaneously in my own life experience, which I write about in the book, and that led me to do a study. I became very curious, like, if this is happening to me and it's so meaningful, how is it for other people? And for me, the a pathway in really had to do with Jewish renewal, and understanding that there was this depth to Judaism that I had no idea was there. Growing up with kind of American mainstream Judaism that really became disconnected from the mythic and the mystical. And when I discovered that there were these amazing ways of understanding Judaism that had so much depth and meaning, it's like just like this gateway opened and really ecstatic way. And I started going to Kala, the Jewish renewal gatherings, and Ruach Haaretz, and I saw all these other people who like seemed pretty ecstatic as well. And so I wanted to understand what their experience was. I knew what my own was, and I uh, did a 2-day study with 10 people who were found their way into relationship with Judaism through Jewish renewal. And part of that study, and Sandy Andreessen was one of my co-researchers. She's here today. And part of that study, I just thought to ask, like, what was your family's relationship to Judaism? Was there any trauma? I really didn't know, and it really, to a person, there were 10 people in the study, there was nobody who had not come from a family history of trauma, whether it was from the Holocaust, the Shoah, or from the pogroms in Eastern Europe, or someone as far back as the Inquisition. And but what I started to see was there was a connection between the trauma and the family's relationship to Judaism and how it got transmitted or how it didn't get transmitted.
What
Um,
relationship that you saw?
Well, I saw, and this, um, I think your question is kind of like the central question of the book. So it's like has there's a lot of
We're gonna, we're
ways
gonna
to.
answer in 400
Um,
I know.
but what I saw was, and this is a central premise of the book, that you know Judaism in the um, mid 1800s and 1900s, really went from being having mysticism, especially for the uh, Eastern European Jews. Mysticism was at the heart of Hasidic practice, and most Ashkenazi Jews come from that lineage. But in Central Europe, in Jews were starting to be given more opportunities in like the mid 1800s to participate in the culture. So, like we think of Freud and Einstein, and they were all like living in this time where there was, you could become more part of the culture, but you had to really become more assimilated. And but in that process of assimilation, what happened was there was a real focus on the rational, and there was a real distancing from the mystical. So um, by the time of like the early 1900s in Germany, there was, Jewish studies was all rational, and mysticism was really like looked down on as like nonsense or superstition, or um, so that's just a big cultural thing that happened. We lost our connection to the mystical. But also in the level of trauma, when we go through trauma, we go we get cut off from our own depths. And so I started to see a correlation between those two things, and even to see the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah, which was the science, making Judaism more rational, as a kind of traumatic response, that to survive, Jews had to give up their depths and try to look more like, you know, the Christian culture around them. And what got lost in that process was, the heart of Jewish mythic imagination.
Mm, mm. You, in the book, you draw parallels between Jungian psychology and Jewish mysticism. And I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about that.
So yes, and this I just was really, I learned so much, like so many things connected. So um, Jung lived during this time to late 1800s and through the 1900s, and he saw what was going on with Christianity. Was there was also a breakdown. People were leaving the church, and he felt like the old religious forms weren't speaking to people anymore, and people were losing, like the church used to be the connection to the depths for people, and they were losing that, and also going very rational. And he saw that people needed to connect to the depths, and that what was starting to happen was people were accessing the depths through their own dreams, and through listening deeply in an inner way. And so he talked about um, like the ego is what our conscious awareness, what our kind of everyday awareness, and that we had this other part he called the self, that was connected to the collective unconscious, which was like all the myths and all of human history, like that we could have a dream about a Greek myth, or so he was very interested in this reconnection with myth. And at the same time that Jung was talking about this, Gershom Scholem, who kind of really was the father of the reclamation of Kabbalah, um, was doing the same thing in Judaism. He was connecting us from this rational mind to this mystical mind. And what was really fascinating to me is that Gershom Scholem and Jung started meeting together after World War II at these series of conferences at Eranos, and with all these people who are very interested about reconnecting with mythic consciousness. So these kind of two streams actually really come together.
I had no idea they met. I want the movie. I want the opera version of that. Um, so that's so interesting. The two different levels of ego are a little bit like what the Hasidim would call maybe mochin de katnut and mochin de gadlut,
Yes,
the small consciousness and the expanded consciousness. So
yes,
for so in terms of tapping into the mythic and the ancestral that you're talking about, uh, the so many Jews who come from Ashkenazi families that immigrated to America, so many of us don't have our stories. Like there was such a disconnection that our ancestors came here and they wouldn't talk about. So many people don't know even the name of the town that their families came from. Um, so how do you do your remembering and your deep knowing when you've been deprived of all the information?
yeah, yeah. Well, I just want to really catch the first thing you said. The small mind to the large mind is really like the essence of the Exodus story, and really the essence of the book. How do we move from the small mind that's disconnected from ancestral memory or from myth? How do we find our connection to it? And I think the story of the Exodus is that story. And um, I think the reason that the story has so much resonance is because Jewish people have been going through this in so many different ways over so many centuries of disconnection and having to find a way back into connection or to stay connected. Um, it's a very deep question. How do we find our way back? And I don't have much knowledge of um, where my family came from. Although on my father's side, while I was writing the book, um, uh, second cousin, started doing some genealogy and was able to find the name of a town in Russia, and some stories about my great grandfather. And then I was able to go online. There's a wonderful I think through Yivo, but there's a Yizkor book project, which if you do have even a little bit of information, there's so much being done now where I think you've talked about this, Erwin, about these Yizkor books where people are recreating the history of whole villages and names and stories. Um, the story of my great grandfather's village was quite tragic, um, which I would never have known that history if I didn't know the history of that village. But um, there were after he left, there was a massive pogrom, and a large percentage of the Jewish population was killed. And when Jeff and I were traveling we were in Paris, and we went to the Shoah memorial there, and there was a um, picture of the mass grave at Proskorov, which is where they were from. And so the Jews that did survive were all killed in the Shoah. I wouldn't have known any of that if this cousin hadn't done that research, and that was just smallest bit of information. So I think that's one part of the answer, is that I think we actually can access more information now because so much reconstruction is being done. And places like Poland, which were really closed down to reconstructing memory, are now opening up to that. But the other part, which I think is also, um, you know, painful and difficult, is, but also very hopeful to me, is that, and this was a way in for me. I just really started listening to my dreams, and my spiritual teacher of many years, Two Bears, is here, and she taught me a practice many years ago of connecting with my ancestors in meditation. And I began that practice with her before I had any connection to Judaism, and that really, after I started doing these meditations, all of a sudden, all these things started happening in these very uncanny ways. So I think, um, you know, it's, uh, it's wonderful to bring in the non-rational mind and see what's possible when we connect with our ancestors.
Hmm. The most people writing an academic level of book um, might not say a lot of this came to me through dreams or through ancestral voices that came to me through meditation. How does it feel to actually say that out into the world?
Well, it brings up a really nice memory. I only got to meet with Reb Zalman once. Reb Zalman is the founder of Jewish Renewal, and a lot of the book is about his work. And thanks to Judith Goldman, who's also here, she helped me arrange a meeting. And I started talking to him about this, and he said, "How are people going to know that you're not Meshuggah?" And I didn't really know how to answer that, but I said, well, I'm training at the Jung Institute in San Francisco, and people talk about these things, and it's kind of understood that we have ways of receiving other than. And when I said that, and this was also very such a meaningful thing, he started talking about Eric Neumann, who was a Jungian who was similar to Gershom Scholem. He started in the 30s, and he moved to Palestine, Israel, and he was a Jungian, and he was Jewish, and he really felt that for Jews who were kind of in this rationalist place and didn't have a connection to the depths, that if they started listening to their dreams, and that, and did certain Jewish practices, that would open up the gateway to this world, this mystical world. And is one of my favorite things I also learned talking to Reb Zalman and then researching, is that so that was like in the late 50s, he wanted to move, he was planning to move to Israel to become an analyst, to go into analysis with Eric Neumann. And Eric Neumann died that year. He died really young. Um, but that was another connection, kind of how does this all go together? I really started to see that what Reb Zalman was doing with Jewish Renewal was what Eric Neumann suggested could be done, that through engaging Jewish practice, we could open the gateway to Jewish mythic imagination, and that is transformative. In that same way that Jung talked about, when we open to the depths, we grow and change.
I suspect if we look back on Jewish history, we would see paroxysms of this, of times of tremendous trauma, followed by times of spiritual renewal, the Hasidic movement itself. And you write about this in the book about the Baal Shem Tov, who founded the uh, the movement that we call Hasidism. in the wake of like the Khmelnytsky massacres, right? Tremendous like violence that was um, until the Holocaust was like the greatest time of violence against Jews in one place in one time in history, and how in the wake of that, the Baal Shem Tov gave gave Jewish people new tools to be able to connect in a deeper way for the sake of their healing. And I think we see, in some ways, Reb Zalman's work in the last decades, um, which, again, on the heels of like the Shoah, on the heels of the Holocaust, as being very parallel to that. A way in which sort of the American Judaism that formed in this country through the immigrations and through the Enlightenment that created a Judaism that was dry in so many ways, that was devoid of um, mysticism, and the angels were removed from the prayer books, didn't have the spiritual tools for handling what it meant to be Jews living uh, in this country in this moment. And Reb Zalman came to offer something something new that's very parallel to what the Baal Shem Tov offered in the 18th century. I don't know if there's a question in that, but I appreciated your identifying that in the book and seeing sort of this pattern of trauma followed by spiritual renewal.
That really comes from, I think Gershom Scholem looked at, he looked at the history of Jewish mysticism and identified the flowering of Jewish mysticism as a historical um, spiritual response to trauma. So after the destruction of the temple, the Hechalot and the Merkabah mysticism, and after the Inquisition in Spain, the Lurianic Kabbalah in the 1500s, and then after the massacres in Eastern Europe, the Hasidim. And then there's a beautiful quote that I include in the book where he says, the Shoah was such a unfathomable and unprecedented level of violence, and he thought that there would be a response. He wrote that in, I think, 1960. He said, but it would take time, equal to the amount of time that the level of the trauma to be able to have a response. And Reb Zalman was a refugee from the Shoah, and yeah, I think it's very much in that lineage of a response to trauma. And
We just need to take a breath after invoking so much violence that our people have experienced. Maybe let's just take a breath for a moment. So much of the beauty in the book is that you you retell and unveil so many beautiful moments, important moments of our mythic stories, and turn them into medicine. You turn them into tools for healing. And you do this brilliantly again and again, using the story of the Exodus from Egypt as the thread. And I was hoping maybe you could read a bit for us and give us an example of what the flavor of that medicine is.
mm-hmm. Yes, I'd be happy to. I picked out a passage, and I just want to say too, because it is really our history is so heavy and tragic and full of grief, and and I just also want to say what I saw in the Exodus story is there was a trauma theorist that I read, a Jungian, John Wilson, who said every culture has a story about healing trauma because every culture experiences trauma. And he talked about post-traumatic growth, and that's really how I see the story of the Exodus. And I talk about that, that we're not going back, we're not going back and making everything all better. It's, we have been through something unfathomable as a culture, and yet the Exodus story teaches us how to grow, how to open again to faith. And I think, just to go back a little bit about the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidism, the way that he and the early Hasidim, it was all about returning to the body and to feeling, um, and I think that is a response to trauma, that we go into our heads and we lose our feeling, we lose our ability to symbolize and make meaning and to have joy. And so, the pathway back is one of great, um, a promise of reconnecting with the sacred, but also reconnecting with feeling and love and joy and growing in our capacity. So let's see, I have a little passage about this. So we're going into uh, Passover next week, and I just want to introduce this. This is like, so we're kind of taught in the Passover story that we're slaves in Mitzrayim, and then Moses is born, and Moses leads us out of um, so one of the wonderful things I found in really getting into the midrash, which are the folk stories, the rabbinic legends, was there was all this wonderful stuff about the feminine and what part the feminine plays in the Exodus story, and that's a big part of the book. So this is, how did we first begin to move from the clay pits of Egypt into out of despair? What are the first movements out of the despair? So I'll go ahead and read, and this is called this little segment is called Mirrors of Love. According to Midrashic legend, the Hebrews begin to move out of exile by the women inviting the men to move out of their suffering into a dance of playful eros using mirrors. The wisdom of this ancient story reflects current research about healing from trauma, that relatedness and mirroring of our suffering allows us to open to the new possibility of a future different from the past that has held us in its grip. The way out of exile comes first, not through heroic pronouncements, but through the gentle murmuring of love. According to the 4th century Midrash Tanhuma, when the men were subjected to back-breaking labor in the clay pits, the Pharaoh issued a decree that they should neither lie with their wives nor sleep in their own homes. Rabbi Shimon, son of Halafta, said, "What did the daughters of Israel do? They went down to draw water from the Nile, and the Blessed Holy One prepared for them small fish in their pitchers, some of which they sold and some of which they cooked. The women brought wine from the proceeds made from the sale of the fish. Then the women went out to the fields where they fed their husbands. After they had eaten and drunk, they would take their mirrors and gaze into them along with their husbands. She would say, 'I am more beautiful than you.' and he would say, I am more handsome than you. Thereby, they would induce themselves to desire and were fruitful and increased. The Blessed Holy One attended to them, enabling them to conceive immediately. It is said that from far away you could see the glint of light reflecting off the thousands of mirrors in the field, the sign of the fertile couplings of the young lovers. Following this night of coupling, some of the women gave birth to twins, and others to sextuplets. Others say 12 in one belly, others say 600,000. This entire total came about through the mirrors, by the merit of those mirrors, showing them to their husbands, inducing them to desire. Out of the midst of the crushing labor, they produced all those multitudes. From this night of love emerges the generation of Hebrews who will leave Egypt, among them Moses. The Midrash teaches us that when we are at our most bereft, when we can no longer envision a future for ourselves different from the limited, enslaved consciousness in which we have been mired, we need someone to show us our beauty, to remind us of who we are and who we may yet become. The first act in furtherance of liberation is imagination. And that act of imagination is brought forth in love, is brought to us by someone, either an inner or outer beloved, who sees our true essence. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That is so beautiful. So the energy of it is so beautiful. Um, so just the artistry with which you take that story, and the mystical understanding of it, right? That it was, the women uh, arousing their husbands that aroused the divine to bring us forth out of Egypt. But also how you turn that into a hard look at how we recover from trauma. That one piece of saving yourself is recognizing that you have a self worth saving, um, and using imagination to do that. So I guess maybe one question that comes to mind for me is, how do you turn that into practice? Like, what is the practice that arises out of this, either ritually in the Jewish world, or clinically in a psychology practice?
Well, I think, mirroring is talked about a lot in psychology and also in parenting. That the baby or the child knows itself and its potential through being mirrored through the eyes of its mother, father, and I think in therapy and also in spiritual practice. I mean, in the book, I talk about the experience of people in Jewish renewal who had a spiritual teacher who opened up for them a possibility of a larger consciousness. And it's reminding me that I also find this fascinating, that there's this idea that psychotherapy itself comes from the Hasidic rabbi student relationship, that the rabbi could see in the student the soul potential, and that the rabbi's job is to bring that soul potential forth. So I think in all those ways, that, and also sometimes our relationship with the divine, with having a meditation or a spiritual practice that's even a solitary practice, where we can move out of what you said, that small mind, into a larger mind, and from that larger place, um, get beyond the maybe limited story that we have of who we are and who we can become. I will just this just thought came in, but it feels very related. I think we acknowledge the movement out of the small mind or out of the narrow place. I think several times a day, and each prayer, each period of prayer, and it's just so woven into our tradition that we're constantly being invited to move out of the small mind, what Jung might call the ego, into this larger mind that, yeah.
So one element of healing that's available to us all the time when we touch it is about embodiment, is about ecstatic practice, it is about reaching a deeper connection with ancestors, with the collective unconscious, with the divine. Um, a lot of the book focuses on specifically the healing qualities of connecting with the sacred feminine. And I'm hoping that you can say a little bit more about the healing nature of that particular connection and why it's important for us.
Well, um, the feminine, the sacred feminine, the Shekhinah is um, what we're talking about in so many ways. It's mythic consciousness um, in Jungian thought. The masculine is thought to be associated with the ego, or our awake consciousness, and the self, or the these larger realms of mythic consciousness, or the collective unconscious, is thought of as the feminine. So uh, right there, everything we've been talking about, opening to this larger consciousness that is opening to the feminine. And I talk about it that way in the book, that kind of shift, that Judaism has been very caught in a kind of rational place, which is very male, very kind of hierarchical, very patriarchal. A lot of what we grew up with. I mean, um, I know when I was growing up, women were just starting to get bat mitzvah. There were no women rabbis. I mean, I think that's true for many of us in the room. So, what happened, and this also is a big part of our history, is the Jewish feminism and Jewish women having a voice in the interpreting the tradition, and a lot of Jewish renewal, and it's happening, I think, in many reconstructing Judaism, where Jewish women as spiritual leaders are creating rituals, have been for many years, and teachings and understanding of the text, and also um, non-hierarchical forms of Judaism, or circles where everybody's voice is included. That's very in the feminine. Embodied practice, where we're not just in our heads, but we're chanting, we're moving, we're meditating. Um, that's all. I feel very, the Shekhinah is the embodied presence, the presence that we can feel in our bodies, and we can feel in the every living thing. So um, I think it's happening on so many levels. And one thing that I find very meaningful is that, and I think Rabbi Leah Novik, who writes on the Shekhinah, says this, is that we've had the divine feminine in Jewish myth and mysticism for, centuries and centuries, but this time is so exciting in a way. Really, in the last 50 years is the time when Jewish women are able to bring their interpretations and their voices, and that's completely transformed Judaism. And I think, and gay and lesbian and transgender rabbis, and I think we're living in a time where Judaism is being so transformed. And also, if that hadn't happened, I would imagine that many of us in the room today would not be here. That made it possible. I know for me, And I think for many people, it just made it possible to come back to Judaism because it was someplace I could feel a home in that I didn't feel growing up in the more patriarchal forms.
You want to tell us a little bit about your relationship with Judaism as you were growing up? You write in the book a lot about your relationship with your grandparents, and your grandparents were a little bit unusual in our usual American Jewish Ashkenazi story.
So so I was very close with my grandparents growing up, and my grandmother was my only of my all my grandparents, the only one who was an immigrant. All the rest were born here. So she was born in Russia and in by the in the Crimea, um, and uh, and then she was like uh, they met at a young socialist dance, not that unusual either for that era of Jewish grandparents, and then they became seekers. And my grandmother, um, I know a lot of this from my this is my mother's parents, but I'm just going to acknowledge my father and my mother grew up in the same neighborhood. So my father's sister, my Aunt Miriam, who I write a little bit about in the book, told me a lot of these stories because she grew up in the same neighborhood. And I just want to say that because my cousin Jason is here, Miriam's son, today from Florida with my parents. Um, so my grandmother like became like a Buddhist in the 1950s, and then she became a Christian, but they stayed Hebrew Christian. They were Messianic Jews. But I grew up going to they had a mission in the Lower East Side of New York where they fed homeless people in the basement. And then they had like, a little chapel. And so one of the stories that my grandfather used to share with me that I include in the book is I was about 4 years old or 5 years old, and I walk into the chapel where they're having a service, and there's a pastor on the pulpit, and I think I walked in through doors here. He's up on the pulpit and he says, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm Jewish." So I think I
That
was
says it all right there.
just but it was interesting. They were and then I think because of their relationship to Judaism, I mean, their home was like they had like pictures of Hasidic people dancing, and then they had like Yeshua, on like the Hebrew name for Jesus. So it was, confusing.
How did that affect your connection and experience with Judaism growing up?
Well, it was kind of on the other hand, I'll say like living, with my dad and my stepmother, and even before then with my father and mother, we always lived in Jewish neighborhoods. I went to Jewish schools. I went to Jewish summer camp. I was in New York. It was like I was Jewish. There was no question for me that. But I think I always had like this little like, am I like outside of this somehow because I, was told my grandparents are so strange, and there's a real taboo, I think, about Messianic Judaism, and so it just, I think, in a way
At the
that
same time,
yeah,
it's also a response to the same impulse that creates Jewish renewal, right? Jews becoming Buddhists, Jews becoming Sufis, all of this is about seeking this connection, this expanded consciousness and spiritual connection that the Judaisms of the first part of the 20th century in America were not offering.
yeah. And I have had that thought. I really thought like they were seeking a very personal relationship with God, and that they found that, in the Christian view. But I really wondered if Jewish renewal had been around, if they would have been able to find that there.
Mm, mm.
And then I also talk in the book about, my grandmother would never talk about her childhood until the very end of her life, and I include her story. I like eventually heard it, but she her family was almost wiped out, and they fled Russia. And I also wondered if it just felt safer to her to have a Christian identity. That it was just there was she was agoraphobic. She never left the house really. So that's another just in the book too, kind of tracing that.
In the book, you draw this connection how as a girl they were so poor, and she would have to steal potatoes from other people's gardens. And then when you were a girl, you remember her standing at the stove frying latkes to serve in the mission for the outreach that they were doing, for the meals that they were serving, and really seeing the sort of the connection of that experience of her childhood and bringing that forward into her adult life.
Yeah, I really started to understand. And I never saw my grandmother when she was not cooking. And I think I can say that literally,
Yeah.
unless
So
she was sitting at the table feeding you.
you say in the book about her what she was doing to try to feed the hungry child inside.
Hmm. Yeah.
I I want to switch gears for a moment, and I'm aware of the time, and ask you a little bit more about the experience of doing the research and the women that you did the research with, because we have a guest who is part of your group who's
Yes.
going to say a few words about that.
Hmm. So I did the research some years ago at Chokmat Halev in Berkeley, and there were 10 people. Well, it's not all women. It was, I think there were 3 men in the study and 7 women, and they were members of the different renewal congregations. And we did a 2-day study, and and I, there everything in the book is a pseudonym for confidentiality, but we have a member of the study who has offering her identity, sharing with us her experience in the study. I'm so grateful she's here. So,
So, welcome, Reb Judith. So
Thank
maybe
you. I
tell us
remember
what
to unmute this time.
the experience.
Yeah, I got to be in the study. And as you talk about it today, I see how much my story and my experience in the study reflects everything you're describing. Um, my grandma came from Russia. She spoke about pogroms. She was an activist, socialist. And my father's family had rejected Judaism because of the rigidity of his father, but there was that desire to be American. So the Judaism I grew up with in Stockton, California, was so Americanized that I didn't see any depth in it at all. We sat in pews and it just didn't seem to have depth. However, we were from a line of rabbis really on both sides of the family before that generation. And as a 3-year-old, my mother told me God is in everything. And it's sort of, there was this Hasidic awakening or presence in me, like, yeah, God is in everything. And I'd look at the doorpost and think, God is in the doorpost, and. And so there was sort of this innate, like, Hasidic transmission, seems like, in a way that I wasn't finding in Judaism that I was exposed to. Then at 15, I read Tales of Hasidim, Martin Buber, where the rabbi doesn't get to the services for High Holy Days because he hears a child crying. There's this heart response to being a human that I loved. But my parents said, oh, it doesn't exist anymore. The Hasidim are very superstitious now. So I thought it wasn't in Judaism. And then actually I came back to Judaism myself in my 50s because I did an adult bat mitzvah. And I finally learned one whole prayer, what each Hebrew word meant. And the Hebrew word for life, the center of it is one of the names of God is right there in the middle of life. And I was drawn into Judaism, and for reading from the Torah, where some of the letters have crowns, they're like holy letters. And so I started going to morning services, and I felt the flow of the service, your body to your emotions, up to the angels, you can say the Shema and so on. And I fell in love with Judaism in that way. And then I found Jewish Renewal, where there's this joy. And I think that my sense of Judaism is, God within reality, and it's joy, and it's everywhere in reality. And that's celebrated in the Jewish Renewal movement. So I got into the rabbinic program at Jewish Renewal, and then rabbinic chaplaincy, because I wasn't doing it fast enough. And what am I trying to say? Anyway, Judaism became a joy for me, which it still is. And the connection with my ancestors, which you called my attention to through the study. It turns out the mythology on the family is in one line, we're descended from Shneor Zalman, right? This great Hasidic rabbi that wrote the Tanya, this great mystical writing. On the other side, supposedly the Vilna Gaon, who's the great genius of Vilna, who was also a mystic, but the enemy of Shneor Zalman. That's why I have so much Mishigas in my family. And then when I was in the Jewish Renewal rabbinic program, I took a class in distance healing. And while I was in that class, I had a dream, gives me tears a little bit, actually, that my relatives, my grandparents, my grandma's Hasidic Jewish grandparents came to me with her sister, who had many difficulties, and asked for healing for her. And my remembrance in the dream, I referred them to the soul of Rebbe Yitzhak, that he would take care of her. But anyway, it was a connect with those great grandparents that I never knew, but I knew were wonderful human beings, and were before a disconnect in my family line when somebody's mother died and she didn't have mothering and all that. Anyway, so that connection with my ancestors has become very, you reminded me to meditate on it too, Bears. Thank you. I'll try to do that. I'll try to do that because I can see how helpful that can be to me. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Judith.
Reb Judith, it's interesting to me that you settled so deeply into Jewish renewal that it was such a source of renewal for you. And your brother became a Buddhist.
Uh-huh.
Wondering about those sort of both responding to a similar familial situation.
Yeah. Well, to me, the urgent thing is to connect with holiness, right? So for me, I was very lucky to find it in Judaism, where we have roots and we have so many connects. And then my brother certainly has his way of connecting with holiness that works for him. So I don't nag him about it.
Thank you for sharing, Reb Judith.
Thank you, Reb Judith. Thank you for participating in the study. And I just want to say the people who gave their time during the study, that's really, the book really grew out of sitting with the stories and seeing how to make meaning of them. So I'm so grateful.
I also want to take a moment just to let you talk about the cover art, because the book itself is beautiful, and I'm going to share my screen so people can see it.
Great. I don't know if Elaine is here. This is Elaine Greenwood's work, and I just wanted to share a story about. I saw she posted this on Facebook, I think, and I just saw her painting, and I thought, oh wow, I would kind of like that would make a beautiful cover. And I didn't know anything else. I just saw the painting itself, didn't know the name or anything. So around the same time, I was trying to think of the title of the book, and I really spent a lot of time thinking about something about the Shekhinah or the divine feminine, and the word, in her radiance, because the Shekhinah, another word for Shekhinah is radiance. So I was like, in her radiance, or in the radiance of the Shekhinah, or um, but it didn't quite fit to have that be the title, so I let it go. But it was very strong in me. So I then heard that Elaine was having an open studio and she was going to be showing this, and I just thought it'd be great to see it up close. And Jeff and I went to her studio, which is beautiful, and on South A Street. And I hadn't said anything to Jeff before about painting. We walked in and he just like gravitated to it and just fell in love with it. And I will just say we rarely agree on art. So that in itself was just wonderful. He loved it and I loved it. And then I sat down with Elaine and I said, "What's it called?" And she said, "Radiance."
Mm.
So, so then I knew it had to be on the cover. So
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
yeah. And I think people have really responded to the artwork of it, So thank you, Elaine, so much.
Mm. Mm. Um, I think we have time to open up the floor for questions. So if folks have questions, go ahead and unmute. Don't wave your hand, but unmute, and I will see that you have unmuted.
I just wanted to say one other thing while we're gathering that, which is when you were talking about Buddhist path, and that I'm hoping the book is a lot about reconnecting with Jewish memory, but really in its essence, the story of the Exodus is about reconnection with the self or with the sacred, and it um, I just think it really, I know there are people here, and I hope people who read the book who aren't Jewish, but um, I think we're all living in a time of disconnection from cultural memory, from the mythic, and that this is one story. It's, in a way, a universal story in the sense that it's, the Exodus is part of, many traditions, and even thinking about the way it lived in, Harriet Tubman as Moses, and liberation of African American people. So I just want to say that too, that I hope that it comes through that this myth is really a myth of reconnection, not just in a Jewish context, but in a wider context. So.
Mm. Mm. Lovely. Do we have any questions? Alyssa.
Yeah. Hi, Shoshana.
Hi, Alyssa.
First of all, I just want to say it's wonderful to hear you talk about your book and hear more of the background. I know that when I met you, even many years ago, you were already working on it. So it's wonderful to hear about all your thinking you've been doing, and I'm really excited to read the book. And my question is, I know you've said a little bit about this already, but I'd just be really fascinated to hear any other maybe concrete thoughts you have about either us working individually or when you work with clients, how to help people who are dealing with trauma move into a place of more openness and more openness to the sacred or to mystical experience.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Um, you know, I didn't go through each chapter. So I really found that the Exodus is the mystical teachings about the Exodus are very psycho spiritual, they're very psychological. And so I think it really does create a pathway to healing. And So I'll just give a little kind of sketch of what I talk about in the book. But one is this mirroring and just holding people with love and sensitivity, and helping people, through art or dreams, just reconnect with the imaginal, with one of the things that trauma shuts down is our ability to symbolize, and that comes from the work with Holocaust survivors, and that just being able to make symbolic meaning is so healing and opens up the narrow kind of constrictedness of trauma. And then I think that grieving, there's a lot about grieving. What I really also saw and understand is that this shutting down that we're talking about, or going into the head as a trauma response, is really a shutting down because there was so much feeling that couldn't be felt and couldn't be processed. And in families with trauma histories, as many of us have, the ability to feel and grieve what maybe was kind of frozen in the family system. That's a big, part of the journey. So my screen is doing something strange, so I'm just trying to find a list.
Shoshana,
Yes.
Shoshana, as you were working on this book, what was a particularly exciting, juicy element that kept you energized?
Mm-hmm. There were several, but I felt like there's this great word I learned called panchrony, panchronistic, across time. And I think Jonathan Boyarin, who's in Jewish cultural studies, talked about the Talmud as like, that's something that we've always done. We've been in conversations across time. The rabbis from one era were talking with rabbis from another era. And I felt like I was doing that. I was in this conversation across generations and centuries, and I felt like I was just immersed in this fascinating conversation. And so I felt, even though it was a very solitary experience writing, I didn't feel alone. I felt like well accompanied.
There's another Greek term in the book that was new to me that is very exciting, and I want to ask you about it. Neurognosis.
Mm-hmm.
And what that experience is like, and how it's relevant for us in with our short historical.
So there's a wonderful teaching that many of us may have heard, that before we're born, an angel comes and tells us everything about our lives. In another version, an angel comes and tells us the whole Torah. And then as soon as we're born, the angel comes and says, shh. And that indent above our lips is that angel fingerprint. And so neurognosis was a term I came across.
And at that moment, we forget all that we learned.
And at that moment, we forget everything that we learned, right? And so neurognosis comes from people who studied ritual and mythic imagination. And they said there can be an experience when we're learning something as if we already know it. Like we're recognizing something that it's like, yeah, I knew that, but I didn't know I knew that until you just said that to me. And that was my experience with Jewish renewal was when I started to take classes and get open to the teachings. It was like, that's how I've always thought about things, but I, you know, really hadn't had that experience of the teachings matching up so much with my internal knowing. And I found that really amazing and very validating. I was like, oh, this feels familiar.
I think a lot of us have had that experience of, especially as children who are just so spiritually connected and spiritually curious, and that there are things that we think we know, and then they're inconsistent with the doctrine we're being given, and um, we end up, if not forgetting, at least diminishing what we knew through our own experience, our own bodily experience. Um, but it's a wonderful word, and it's also, it ties for me with what you're talking about, receiving information through dreams, um, that you have this chance um, to recover learning and recover connections that have been severed. Um, and this is a beautiful piece of both the book and the process leading to the book.
Hmm.
Um, we're Robin, were you unmuting for a
Yes,
question?
I was.
Go ahead.
Shoshana, I'm wondering if you are in the process of or have been coordinating the embodiment aspect of things in your own practice in some way or other, since you discussed how important it is that we have things in our bodies we may not know about, maybe holding.
Yes, it's part of my training was in somatic therapy, and my first therapy for a long time was a somatic therapy with a German man who's a wonderful human being. And so, yes, so much, and such an important question. So much of trauma lives in the soma and in the body, and often we can't access it through our thinking mind, that we have to go through the body and notice what we're feeling and notice where there are constrictions and as we explore those feeling states in the body, things arise, memories, um, images. There's a beautiful book by Arnold Mindell called The Dreaming Body that I love, that our bodies are filled with dreams. And so, yes, very much a gateway.
Shoshana, what are you feeling in your body right now?
Hmm. I'm feeling a lot of tenderness and connection. I'm looking at my screen. I can see Robin is big on my screen right now. And it's so wonderful to, as I saw the room filling with people, it's just so much love and connection. And so feeling that.
We're going to have a last question from Barbara Lesh McCaffrey.
I had one too.
I don't know who said that, but
That sounds like Elaine.
Okay. So Barbara?
Shoshana, thank you so much. As I've been listening, I know that in this room are a number of people who are Holocaust descendants, who are involved in telling their stories, especially to middle and high school students, in terms of the way in which they've dealt with the trauma of their family history and how it informs our commitment to deal with intolerance around us. And I'm wondering if there's particular wisdom that you have found in the process of writing the book a way of holding self as you are dealing with very painful past.
Mm-hmm.
And I am so appreciative of the work that you've done.
Thank you, Barbara.
I just have a short thing to say to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, hi, Elaine.
Oh, hi.
Elaine is the artist of the book cover.
Well, thank you for using my painting for the cover. It meant a lot. It means a lot to me. And the title of it being Radiance, I just want you to know that since I've known you, you're a very radiant being. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Eliora?
Mutual.
Are you going to ask a question?
I just wanted to respond to you, Barbara, your question about how to hold. I think that's where Jewish renewal, I think, has been and reconstructing Judaism and our temple there at Ner Shalom, but to have a spiritual practice, to have a community of fellow travelers, spiritual or not, just to be in community. I think there's so many things, social justice, and I think to take what we've learned from our cultural trauma, and I know that the work that you do with the Holocaust and genocide work to bring it forward so that genocides are not repeated. Anything that brings us meaning and connection, and I think also practices that can help us hold a lot of suffering. I think that is something. I think that when the suffering is too big, when we're too close to it, like the generation that of survivors, there was so much suffering to hold. It was intolerable, and I almost feel like we're I don't know how to say it, like we're all helping metabolize the suffering collectively, and that we hold each other in it, and that we have ways to hold ourselves through therapy or artwork or spiritual practice or meditation, and connecting with the ancestors and with the larger forces, the earth, the great mother, all the things that sustain us. And Rabbi, I think you're muted.
I am sorry about that.
Shoshana, can I say
Judy?
something?
Yes,
this is Judy Veneer. I'm listening in my car.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that what you talked about for your book really resonated for me. Reflecting on my experience in Orthodox Judaism and how I feel it was definitely something I was turning to help me with the intergenerational trauma that I grew up with, and how Jewish renewal really saved me. And I just really resonated with your idea of this repetition of the trauma for our people. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Thank you so much, and congratulations.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you. Judy shared with me that she was in a Jewish women's study group with Savina Toibal, whose work I cite in the book is was really a touchstone for me about how the ancient priestess traditions came in through the early Genesis stories, and I love talking with Judy about that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful. Her book, Sarah the Priestess, is a must-have, a must-read. So, Shoshana, we are so proud of you and so happy for you, and we're going to close our discussion, Atzila Solat is going to offer Shehechianu for us. Atzila, we're in your hands, and we celebrate this moment, this birth, Shoshana.
Thank you. Thank you, Atzila. Atzila has been an ally through the thick and thin of this journey. Thank you.
So inspiring, Shoshana. And I feel very expanded just by being in this event with you and having this time with you and Reb Irwin. So much gratitude. Thank you. So just marking this moment in community with you. Oh, mystery, grace unfolding. Oh, miracle, it's you alone. Oh, mystery, grace unfolding. Oh, miracle, who brings us home. Shehianu, Veki Emanu, Vehigianu, Lazman Hazeh. Shehianu, Veki Emanu, Vehigianu, Lazman Hazeh. Oh, mystery, grace unfolding. Oh, miracle, it's you alone. Oh, mystery, grace unfolding. Oh, miracle, who brings us home. Shekianu, Veki Emanu, Vehigianu, Lazman Hazeh. Shekianu, Veki Emanu, Vehigianu.